The air inside the royal meditation chamber was 94 degrees and tasted like oxidized copper. It had been exactly 41 days. Empress Helena of the Netheri sat at the exact center of the long ironwood table. She was wearing the cerulean state gown. She had been wearing it since the beginning. The heavy, formal fabric was meant to be worn for 6 hours during diplomatic ascensions, not slept in, not lived in, and certainly not left to marinate in the stifling heat of a sealed room. The gold thread along her collar was stiff with dried sweat. Her sensory vines hung motionless. For a healthy Netheri, the thick, pale tendrils that cascaded from the crown of the skull down to the shoulders were a secondary respiratory system, tasting the air for moisture and chemical shifts. Elena's vines were brittle. They were gray at the tips, and they hadn't tasted fresh humidity in over a month. Her attendants had stopped knocking on day 18. At first, they had pleaded through the heavy oak doors. Then they had whispered. Now they did not even walk down the eastern corridor of the laundry bay adjacent to her chamber. The empire was either running itself or burning to ash. She did not know. She did not care. Pushed beneath a stack of ignored trade ledgers on the table lay a single white ceremonial glove. It was mostly hidden. Only the edge of the silver cuff was visible. Elena stared at the wall above it. The heavy iron latch of the servant's entrance clicked. It was not a minister. It was a human in a soot-stained leather apron. Gabriel. He was 34 standard years old. His left shoulder sat permanently lower than his right from a decade of carrying brass buckets of rendered tallow. He was a candle keeper, the absolute lowest functional gear in the machinery of the palace ecology. He carried a wooden caddy filled with fresh wicks. He did not announce his presence. He just walked into the 94-degree heat with a heavy, shuffling step. She did not turn her head. Gabriel set his caddy down by the eastern wall. He was entirely invisible to the upper echelons of the court. Humans were considered functional infrastructure. They were sturdy, remarkably quiet, and lacked the biological complexity to participate in high-level diplomacy. He pulled a small wooden step stool to the first grand sconce. He stepped up. He reached for the melted ruin of a pillar candle. His knee popped. The sound cracked like a structural failure in the massive silent room. Gabriel winced. He paused, rubbing his kneecap with a wax-coated thumb. He glanced over his shoulder. Elena did not flinch. Netheri sensory vines possess a complex autonomous defense mechanism, retracting flush against the skull when presented with an apex predator or when the subject feels utterly unobserved. Elena's vines were plastered flat against her collarbone. She did not register him as a threat. She did not register him as a living entity. Gabriel turned back to the wall. He chipped away the blackened wax with a brass scraper. He replaced the thick wick. He wiped the soot from the reflective backing plate. He did this every single day. He was a ghost moving through a tomb dedicated to a ruler who was technically still drawing breath. He smelled the stagnant, a heavy air. A candle keeper had no business noticing the dry fraying threads of an empress's royal gown. But he noticed. He moved to the grand table, the center of the room. He needed to replace the triad of illumination candles sitting near the neglected ledgers. He stepped into her immediate perimeter. The heat radiating off the Empress was immense. It was a dry, feverish aura that made the back of his neck prickle. Gabriel smelled the dust settling on her skin. He saw the edge of the single white glove poking out from under the heavy books. He did not touch it. He looked at the grand arched window behind her. It was sealed shut with 3 heavy iron latches. It had been sealed for 41 days to protect the sovereign from the fluctuating humidity of the lower city during her isolation. Gabriel set down his brass snuffer. He looked at the hardened wax coating his knuckles. He looked at the Empress. She sat perfectly rigid, locked in a paralysis of her own making. "That's a long shift," he muttered. He did not direct the words at her. He spoke to the stifling heat. He bypassed the candles entirely. He walked around the grand table, stopping directly in front of the massive arch window. He gripped the lowest rusted iron latch. He threw his weight backward. He opened the window. A draft of evening air cut through the stagnant heat. The heavy velvet drapes rippled once, brushing against the stone floor, pulling the sharp scent of crushed ozone and impending rain into the stale room. Elena fractured. The violent influx of oxygen hit her desiccated vines like a physical blow. For 41 days, she had been recycling her own decay. The cool, damp night air slammed into her face. Her chest hitched involuntarily. Her vines spasmed. The gray, brittle tips flared with a sudden, desperate rush of bioluminescent green sap. It hurt. The sensation was agonizingly sharp. She had forgotten what the world outside this geometric prison actually felt like. She felt the crushing, infinite weight of her physical exhaustion crash down on her all at once. Simultaneously, an irrational surge of anger at the structural integrity of the window hinges flared in her chest. Why did they yield? They were supposed to be permanently sealed. If the outer guard realized the atmospheric seal was broken, protocol dictated that they would immediately initiate a full lockdown sequence and the wind hit her again. She closed her eyes. The protocol evaporated, and nothing mattered except the cold dampness settling against her flushed skin. Her body sagged. The rigid, perfect posture of the Nethiri sovereign collapsed by a fraction of an inch. She made no sound. The physical relief was so intense it bypassed conscious thought entirely. She was so tired. She was just so unbelievably tired. The echo of the draft moved through the vast chamber. It caught the loose, brittle edges of the parchment on the grand table. The papers rustled. The single white glove pinned beneath the ledgers fluttered against the current. It shifted just enough to fully expose the silver crest embroidered on its cuff. Outside the heavy oak doors, the texture of the silence changed. A guard shifted his weight, his halberd scraping the stone. Another cleared his throat, and they could smell the rain bleeding into the corridor from the gaps beneath the doorframe. The tomb had been breached. Gabriel stood by the open window. His hands were covered in soot. He noticed that the middle iron hinge was missing a secondary retaining pin. Maintenance really should have caught that during the last solstice inspection. He did not look back at the Empress. He simply picked up his brass snuffer, moved to the next unlit sconce on the western wall, and went back to his routine. The room breathed. For the first time in 41 days, the Empress breathed with it. The scraping of brass against hardened wax was the only sound in the empire. Gabriel did not turn around. He did not look at the grand ironwood table. He simply moved his wooden step stool to the next sconce, the heavy leather of his apron creaking with the motion. He dug the scraper into the ruined pillar candle. Behind him, the sovereign of the Netheri system was physically unspooling. Her sensory vines, previously locked flush against her skull in a localized trauma response, detached. They fell. They hit her collarbone with the heavy, wet sound of waterlogged ropes dropping onto stone. The bioluminescent green sap that had surged in agonizing defense slowly cooled, shifting into a dull, rhythmic turquoise pulse, the biological indicator of a body abandoning its own siege engines. She did not speak. She lacked the oxygen, the cellular energy, and the will to form syllables. The cool draft from the open window poured over her ruined state gown. The temperature in the chamber was plummeting, and the oxidized copper taste of the air was entirely replaced by the sharp metallic scent of rain hitting the lower city's cobblestones. Still, she remained anchored to the chair, The Nethiri skeletal structure was designed to lock upright during periods of extreme duress, a biological mechanism meant to project authority even in death. Her spine was fighting her exhaustion. The tendons in her neck vibrated with the catastrophic effort of simply staying vertical. Even the silence knew. It was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a collapse in progress. Gabriel finished the western wall. He wiped his hands on a rag pulled from his deep pocket. He picked up his wooden caddy. He turned toward the center of the room, the grand table, and the triad of illumination candles sitting precisely beside the stack of ignored trade ledgers. He walked into her immediate perimeter again. Elena sensed the shift in air pressure. Her dull, pulsing vines twitched. Decades of diplomatic conditioning, the brutal, unrelenting weight of her crown flared in her nervous system. She tried to sit up straighter. She tried to smooth the stiff, sweat-stained fabric of her cerulean gown over her knees. Her fingers trembled so violently they could barely grip the silk. She was trying to rebuild the fortress. She was trying to look like the Empress. Gabriel stopped. He looked down at the ruined wax of the center triad. He looked at the trembling hands of the most powerful entity in the quadrant. He noticed, entirely irrelevantly, that the brass rim of his carrying caddy was starting to oxidize, and he would need to polish that before the quartermaster saw it. He set the caddy on the table. He did not bow. He did not avert his eyes in accordance with standard orbital protocol. He just looked at her, holding a fresh wick in his calloused hand. "You don't need the mask with me." The words were quiet. They were rough with disuse. They carried absolutely no reverence. Elena devastated. The Nethiri skeletal lock disengaged with an audible, sickening click. Her shoulders dropped. The rigid architecture of her spine simply gave way. Her chin fell to her chest. She stopped correcting herself. She didn't weep. Her species did not possess tear ducts, but her vines wept thick, clear sap onto the collar of her gown. She rested her forearms on the heavy ironwood table. In the physical act of letting gravity take her weight after 41 days of resistance was a tectonic event. Standard palace histories maintain that the Empress broke her isolation due to a vision from the ascendant stars, a moment of profound spiritual clarity that guided the empire back to the light. The histories are written by cowards. She broke because a tired man in a soot-stained apron opened a window and gave her permission to stop pretending. She turned her head, resting her cheek directly on the polished wood of the table. She closed her eyes. The deep, rattling breath she took was the sound of a war ending. The candlekeeper was later asked by the Internal Security Tribunal to explain why he had breached the atmospheric seal of the meditation chamber at 0200. His answer, yes, the room smelled dead, was technically accurate and diplomatically catastrophic. Gabriel did not react to the collapse of the sovereign. The structural integrity of the Nethiri spine was documented to withstand extreme kinetic force, but it could not withstand. He picked up his brass snuffer. He began clearing the old wax from the triad. It was already done. The shift was absolute. Elena did not move for the entire 20 minutes it took him to replace the wicks. She simply breathed the cold, damp air, which meant she survived. 9 days later, the middle iron hinge on the grand window was still missing its retaining pin. The heavy velvet drapes were tied back with a piece of rough twine. Gabriel walked into the chamber. It was 68 degrees. He carried his wooden caddy. He shuffled toward the grand table. When Elena was sitting in the same chair, she was wearing a simple, unadorned gray tunic. Her vines were full, hydrated, and a soft, steady pale green. She did not look up when he entered, but she did not lock her spine either. The stack of trade ledgers had been pushed to the far edge of the table. The single white ceremonial glove was no longer hidden beneath them. It rested directly in the center of the polished ironwood. Elena's hand was resting lightly over the silver-embroidered cuff. She waited. She waited for the scraping of the brass. She waited for the smell of melted tallow. She waited for the heavy, shuffling step of a man who did not care that she ruled 1,000 worlds. It wasn't a choice anymore. Gabriel struck a sulfur match against the stone wall. He held a small, trembling flame to the fresh wick.